Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. Today is our first special episode for 2020 and our focus is the universities of the West as we explore the pathologies evident in teaching, research and social activism. Don't forget, Looking Forward is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs and is funded entirely by our members so that we can be a voice for freedom. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au and find out how you can join and or donate. To help us discuss this meaty topic today, we have a very special guest whom I'll introduce in a moment. It's Dr Phil Magness from the American Institute for Economic Research and, most relevantly for today's discussion, an author of a fine book called Cracks in the Ivory Tower. The subtitle of that book is also The Moral Mess of Higher Education, which perhaps gives you an idea of where Phil is coming from. I'll introduce him in a moment, but firstly, here in the studio, we have Dr. Chris Berg from RMIT University.
G'day, Scott.
And on my right, Dr. Bella de Brera, who is the director of the IPA's Foundations of Western Civilization program.
Good afternoon.
Glad you could join us. I'm Scott Hargreaves, editor of the IPA Review. As I mentioned, Phil's day job, if you like, is as a senior research fellow with the American Institute for Economic Research. By way of background, he is an economic historian. I hope we can explore that a little today. He's written across a range of current and historical topics, including trade, tax policy, inequality, slavery, and the economics of higher education. Many listeners will be pleased to know that he writes very much in the tradition of the great public choice economists like Gordon Tullock and James Buchanan. That's what some people actually call economics. Phil Magness, welcome to Looking Forward.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, Phil, I'm glad you can join us. As you know, I've been really looking forward to this. So tell us about the book and particularly why higher education is a moral mess.
Right. So my co-author, Jay Brennan, and I first got into this subject a few years ago when we came across a common realization between the two of us. We were reading higher ed press, which includes publications such as the Chronicle of Higher Education and several academic journals that correspond to that, and the way that they covered the operations of the university systems in the United States. And one of the things that we noticed is they were all depicting a university system in constant crisis. Jobs are collapsing, especially at the faculty level. Administrative growth is out of control. Expenses are out of control. But quite a bit of the conventional wisdom that they were putting forth seemed to operate from a very idealized version of the university system that they never really investigated or proved. And then we started scrutinizing some of the claims that were being made as solutions to fix higher ed. And it wasn't matching up with the data that's being published by U.S. Department of Education and other official sources. So this prompted us to start digging more deeply into the question of what are the incentive structures that make higher ed work. And if you ask people what a university is ideally supposed to do, you'll get a very lofty answer such as expand human knowledge or help people become more well-rounded citizens or citizens of the world, all sorts of high-minded, very good-sounding, lofty promises that are being put forth. But you start to look a little bit behind the curtains of the claims that are made in the university system, and you start seeing it's a lot more like what we experience in just every day-to-day life. It's real people that are flawed and imperfect human beings responding to incentives, including some very bad incentives, and that's where you start to get some of the problems that emerge in the university system.
So let's talk about some of those incentives, and particularly to drill down on why there are moral problems. So what do you see as I'm not going to ask you to rank them, but what are the greatest what are the greatest perversities that you identified or were surprised by in your research?
Right. So I say first and foremost is the way that universities both allocate the cost and expenses of educating students and who they put the burdens of paying for their own operations onto. So we all know from watching the past several decades of universities, especially in the United States, but we also see it in other university systems that follow the Western model, tuition seems to be skyrocketing at paces that far outpace and move ahead of any other similar product in the market in terms of education. It could be anything else. Costs seem to be running out of control. And we see aspects of this reflected in things like student loan debt crises in the United States. There's a big movement at the moment to try and get the government to assume and take on that debt and relieve students for it. But we really want to ask the question, where did that come from in the first place? And why does tuition seem to be going up, ratcheting up year after year after year?
Is it because
with no
the
end in
education
sight?
is just getting so much better, Phil, to clarify?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, professors have gotten so much more skilled at what they deliver.
Yep.
Well, actually, what's really going on is we find that universities essentially operate on a budget maximizing bureaucracy model. In other words, they employ vast numbers of people in faculty roles, in administrative roles, and functionary and auxiliary roles to each of those that seem to be basically in the game, not so much to advance the students or create a better world, as all their marketing material says, but rather to make a decent career out of teaching and researching and operating massive institutions in higher ed. So what ends up happening is if you start to treat the university as essentially a really poorly run government agency, a bureaucracy, you start to see some of the mysteries of why university operations look to be very bad start to make quite a bit more sense through a public choice style model of what's actually happening. And endemic to that public choice approach is you start to see faculty and administrators both engage in an activity we like to refer to as economists as rent-seeking. In other words, lining their own pockets off of the tuition dollars and other sources of income streams that go into the university system.
So still on, and sorry, Chris, I'll just to stay on that
No,
point
please,
because
Scott,
it's so interesting because, of course, people want to, lots of organisations want to maximise their revenue and claim
Absolutely.
rents, but there's sort of there's a polite fiction that somehow the market for courses at least is just that, a market, and that you'd expect the forces of supply and demand to maintain some kind of a balance, but it's almost like the supplier has all the power in this market. I mean, why aren't students able to keep the cost of tuition down is the question. What's operating there?
The big problem is that the finance model of higher ed is all removed from a customer-provider relationship. There's no direct seller of the product of higher education, and there's really no direct consumer. Rather, it's all third-party payments that are passed through either a lender, or in some cases it may be a scholarship system. Some cases it may be the parents of the students that are financing their education. What it comes down to, though, is there's really no price responsiveness between what the students are actually getting from a university system and what that university is providing. And to make it even more complicated, there's not really a clear ownership of the university itself. We operate in a model where universities in the United States are either private institutions run by a very distant board of trustees, or they're public institutions that are vaguely operating in the governmental sphere, but there's not really a direct chain of command of where that ownership takes place. So this is almost a ripe opportunity. It's almost very analogous to healthcare in the United States in some respects, in the sense that there's no direct signals between the payers, the consumers of education, and the providers of education, the faculty, the administration, and the trustees.
What's caused that, though? So as Scott points out, there's a vision of a world in which students need education, and there's a company or a industry that serves to deliver that education to the students. It's strongly in the students' interest. What do you think? That they get that education, and it's strongly in the interest of the industry that they deliver that education. That sounds like a market relationship. Why are we so far away from what looks like a fairly simple idea of a market transaction for a needed service?
Yeah, so quite a bit of it is the heavy amount of government funding that's gone into higher ed. That's really emerged after World War II in the United States. They passed a series of legislation to offer the returning soldiers, an opportunity to enter into the education system. Well, that kind of opens the door to you start offering public benefits and subsidies for other entrants into higher education, some of it very well-intentioned and high-minded. but it's also very ripe for collecting the rents off of that. If you have a public subsidy of something, you also have people that are willing to consume and take from the public subsidy. And over the years of over the past 70, 80 years or so of accretion, we've gotten to a point where higher ed is extremely heavily subsidized, both directly and indirectly through government-financed and supported loan industries. But that subsidy is often just passed right through the tuition payment and into the hands of administrators who respond to the provision of more subsidy by just jacking up the price even further.
So do you think so you talk a lot about how the problem with the sector is sort of bad incentives. Do you think a good incentive could be having, if you're going to continue government funding, could it go straight to the students rather than the bureaucracy itself? Would that be a positive solution?
So almost like a voucher type of a system for higher ed. And I know that's been batted around as an idea. I think you do have some sort of functional attempts at that at the state and local level in the United States, but it's often more focused on what we would consider non-premium, non-top tier institutions. So in other words, you can't get a voucher to go to Harvard and Princeton and Yale, can't even operate in that same sense on like the flagship state institutions. More often you're likely to see something like that operative at a lower tier state institution or a community college. But you also find that those types of institutions are much cheaper than Harvard, Princeton, and Yale.
Now, the argument that you're making, and one of the things that I think is really compelling about your book is pushing against what you've described as things like corporatization of higher education and neoliberalism and so forth. But,
pushing against them as explanations for what's going on.
But doesn't this? Isn't a little bit of that story that, there are just, rent-seeking, hungry bureaucracies? Could you, if you were an academic of the romantic type, which I am certainly not, but, nonetheless, let's imagine that we're academics of the romantic type, wouldn't you look at the evidence that you've pushed out, that you found in your book and point out, yes, exactly, and wouldn't you say that's precisely the neoliberalism, that's precisely the corporatization? They're just sucking money out of students and governments to fund Maseratis. Isn't that consistent? Is my question.
So this has been one of the responses that we've gotten from the book. A typical academic will read it and they will see 7 or 8 or maybe 9 chapters that they agree with, and then they hate 1 or 2 or 3. So they're like, "Oh yes, Magness and Brennan are Magness and Brennan are absolutely right. Administrators are horrible. They're gobbling up resources, and they're absolutely right. Students cheat a lot, and that's bad for the quality of our education." But man, the stuff they're saying about faculty, that's completely unfair. and it would depend on each of the different groups would have a similar response, but it's a different chapter that they're upset about.
Yeah, of course.
So I do take that as a sign that at least some of the evidence we're presenting of the problem is fairly well received. It resonates. It's something that offers a deeper contextual explanation to things that people realize are going on. Yet at the same time, there's a tendency, anyone that is coming at it from that mindset, the idealized mindset, as you put it, will see and recognize the legitimacy and the validity of the problems that we've critiqued. But then when you get to the question of what's actually causing this, what are the underlying mechanisms, they'll set all evidence aside, set all numbers aside, and say, "Oh, well, therefore neoliberalism." Therefore corporatization.
It's a super interesting argument, or your book is super interesting for an Australian audience, because we have many of the same incentive structures, but not all of the same incentive structures.
Right.
And the one that really comes to mind, and the key difference there is who funds the actual students themselves. And so for your context and for listeners' context, in Australia, we have most of a university place is funded by the government. It depends on, for a domestic student anyway, depends on which discipline they're going into and what their degree program is, but most of their education is funded. And then the parts that aren't funded, for most students, they get an interest-free loan for it that they only have to pay back if they meet a certain income threshold. So what that has meant, and plus regulations around how much universities can charge for courses, certainly under those Commonwealth-supported places, has meant that we haven't had that massive tuition cost explosion that it has in the United States. But that has also encouraged, which is similar to the US, I guess, also encouraged really large sort of degree blowouts. So industries that didn't previously need degree qualifications now require degree qualifications. And the other major perversity that I see in the Australian system that I'm interested in your thoughts on, because you don't discuss this as much in the book as I think an Australian version of this book would bring about, is the role of research funding. So a huge amount of research, a huge amount of what universities do is in research is funded by the government, and not just through like what you would call the National Institute of Science and Technology or the Australian Research Council, but just in block grants for research. So how do you see government-funded research plugging into this?
Right. So, to give it a little context, so the United States system is more of a hybrid, I'd say, in that regard. There are quite a few private sources of funding for research, but also quite a few public sources. In that sense, I see campus as a competition to gobble up those resources.
Yes.
I see it that way too, but go on.
Yeah. So you get a system that's operating. At the end of the day, there's a fixed pool of the amount of money that's available to claim, and you have hundreds, if not thousands, of faculty on a given campus jockeying around in their positions to see what they can get to bring home to their own department. Some of that is done ethically through a typical grant pursuing procedure that's subject to peer review. In other instances of it, we find cases where really suspect research is put before grant-making entities and done in such a way, recognizing the fact that they are operating under time constraints and resource constraints to even review the material. So what ends up happening is subpar research does get funded, not so much based on the merits of what's being argued, but rather based on who knows who in the system of research granting, or maybe there are political signals attached to the type of research that's being pursued that tends to get elevated at a higher level than certain other projects that would argue against the same position. Take an example. In economic research, it is a major problem, I'd say, in the United States that one of the primary funders of monetary policy research is the Federal Reserve System. Not exactly a neutral party. So I would say, and I've heard this from friends that work in that area of economics, they're going to have a harder time getting grant funding from a Federal Reserve-related entity making an argument that is proposing an alternative currency system than someone that is making an argument that's very consistent with certain Fed policy.
Not a lot of papers on free banking there.
I have had that precise experience, I'll point out.
This emphasis on research also leads to the other thing you're talking about, because when you bump into academics, some of whom are on the right side of things generally in terms of free markets and so on, but when you start to critique universities, they can be quite resistant. But the one thing they're always happy to talk about is, all these the proliferation of these dreadful administrators, and how they absolutely agree. Yes, there are far, far too many administrators, and that's a sort of a commonplace. But you actually sort of join the dots here and point out that they protest too much in a sense, because again their incentives are actually supporting that growth. Right.
So there's a fascinating thing with administrative growth, especially in the U.S. system, and we trace back the numbers to as early as we could get them, and that was the mid-1970s. And if you follow from about 1974 to today, lower level administrators in U.S. higher ed have essentially quadrupled. It used to be maybe one administrator for every 2 to 3 faculty. Now they have surpassed faculty in actual number. So what's going on here is the big question, because a university in 1974 probably isn't doing all that much more in its day-to-day core functions that a university is today, or at least would be necessary to operate a university today. So what we find is most of the administrative growth is in low-level, student-facing auxiliary functions. These are support offices that have been instituted basically to entertain people when they get to campus. So, and that's everything from entertain them on the admissions office tour, where they go around from facility to facility and see all the fancy rock climbing walls and gym equipment and sports facilities, to people whose job is to basically bring concerts and entertainers and comedians onto campus. And then also we see an explosion of offices that have a pretty overt political function on campus. They sit there to service social justice causes, and that could be everything from environmentalism. You get quite a bit of political causes that are associated with very close to candidates, so almost like electioneering on campus. But these are offices that 30 or 40 years ago simply did not exist and certainly weren't funded. They do exist today, and not only that, they're growing, they're proliferating. They often have massive staffs of a dozen people, each making $100,000 or more, making sometimes more than the faculty. But they're all performing tasks that I would consider non-essential to getting a degree, although they service various constituencies, small isolated constituencies on campus that are not willing to give them up. And one of those constituencies also happens to be the faculty. So faculty will complain all the time, I hate administrative growth, they're taking all our resources. Then you go to the same faculty member and ask the question, well, would you be willing to eliminate the campus Office of Environmental Sustainability? I said, oh no, we cannot do that because climate change, and we have to be showing that we're doing our part.
Well, let's talk.
Okay.
And administrative functions that the faculty themselves used to do.
So it sounds to me as if universities have become a place where, in the eyes of the administrative staff, it exists for them, and the academics think the university exists for them, but nobody really thinks the students are of any consequence whatsoever.
Other than numbers,
but really on a sort of personal basis, I think they'd probably be quite content if the students were just theoretical rather than practical.
Holograms.
But I do actually want to talk a little bit about the academic staff and your conversations about how left-leaning they've become. And especially, you talk about there was a spike in 2001 where there was a very sort of sharp turn to the left. And I'd just like to sort of know why, because the faculties have been that way inclined for a while. At least we can trace it back to sort of the 60s and 70s. What explanation is there for that year? I know it's not political, is it? Is it just a generational thing? Were we waiting for the sort of the flowering of the full leftiness of the academics? Or
Right. So I think there's a couple different factors going in play. And to give a little context, so we have polling data going back to the 1960s that asks university faculty about their political affiliation. And it's always leaned left of center, but it used to be a fairly stable plurality of about 40% of university faculty would identify on the political left. And then of the remainder, you get maybe 20% are moderates and 20% are conservatives or libertarians. So a stable plurality, but it certainly leaned to the left. And after 2000, the share on the left just exploded. It jumped from 40% to upwards of 60% by the latest polls, and that's almost all come at the expense of faculty on the right, of conservatives and libertarians that have been just squeezed out of discipline after discipline. So the oddity, or I guess the great question, is what changed right after 2000 that broke this previous 30 or 40 years of stability and started this sudden, sharp leftward march? I don't think there's any one single factor, but I will offer a couple explanations. The first one is that the academic disciplines, the fields that tend to be more political in nature and tend to be even further to the left than the average faculty, those have surprisingly and against all conventional wisdom and all public narratives grown at a faster rate than anything else on campus. So you read higher ed literature and news coverage, it's all about how the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, have exploded, and the humanities are in the dregs or in the woes. But if you look at the actual job employment data in the United States from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the humanities have grown at a faster rate in their faculty ranks than any other sector of the academy except for healthcare. And there's whole separate reasons why healthcare has grown at that pace. It's just a high demand field. But they've grown faster than the social sciences, than math, than engineering, than the physical sciences. What's that going to do over time if the humanities are starting to outpace other areas of the academy that are less politicized? You automatically get a slow but continuous growth toward politicization as their share on campus gets bigger.
But yet students are leaving the humanities in their droves because they don't want the So is it just going to be a case where there's a department?
Finally, there's the ultimate department.
Yeah, ultimate
which
department.
Is all faculty,
no students. Is that where the humanities are heading? Is that? And
it's absolutely the case that students are voting with their feet. They're fleeing the politicized disciplines. I've done studies of this by taking the faculty ratios of conservative to liberal or Republican to Democrat. There's every single way you measure it. The faculty that fall further to the left, the departments that fall further to the left, and this is things like anthropology, sociology, English, foreign languages, history, philosophy. Those tend to be much further to the left than the physical sciences or engineering, economics, business, anything like that. Those are all shedding majors like crazy. Students year after year are actually declining. They're below their level of majors today from the position they were in 10 years ago, which is a very odd situation. Yet at the same time, they're able to maintain their classroom presence, and this is another thing we discuss in the book, by moving into what we call the Gen Ed curriculum. General education requirements, the classes that every person has to take to get a degree, whether they're a science major, a business major, an English major, everyone has to take those core classes. Well, we find there are limited amounts of data on a few of these disciplines and quite a bit of data on one or two of them. What they show is that the Gen Ed requirements for something like English Composition 101 has essentially doubled in the last 40 years. So in 1975, a typical student may have had to take one semester of English composition. Today, it's 2 to 3 semesters is the norm.
So they're compelling the students to do things, to fill the classrooms, to justify their. And so the students are going to be resentful, I think. And there's a course here at University of Melbourne that all arts students have to do, which is called Power. And it's not power and...
It's not how to take it and keep it.
It's not how to take it and keep it. It's it's the Marxist version of zero sum. Oh. And they all have to do it. And but not only the ones that don't resent it will be. It's really indoctrination as well. It's sort of forced indoctrination. It's not a great model.
Yeah. So what is it in those subjects? So I can understand the importance of having students learn to write, but it strikes me that those subjects are going to be much more theoretically extensive, is a nice way to put it.
Yes. Yes.
So in the typical English composition class, are we learning Marxist theories of paragraphs, or what's actually happening in those classes?
Well, it's hard to quantify. One thing that I have done is I've looked into syllabi where different readings and different authors are assigned. And we can take Karl Marx, although he's not the only symptom of this problem, he's just a prominent case. Marx is very seldom taught in an economics classroom, the discipline where he originally inhabited, where his
Karl
contributions
Marx,
were
economist. Yes, go on.
Exactly. But you'll almost never see him in an economics classroom unless it's a very high-level, specialized class in the history of economic thought. Where you do see him, it's the English classroom. It's the philosophy classroom, the sociology classroom, disciplines that were very foreign to Marx in his own time and day, but have since adopted this paradigm that has been more or less rejected by the economics profession. And that's very clear on syllabi. Marx is one of the Communist Manifesto is constantly up there in the top 2 or 3 most assigned texts in American university classrooms. And it's almost all in the humanities that are doing the assigning of it.
They're probably not reading it that critically.
To be fair, it is very short.
Probably not.
And all this obviously has consequences, and so what do you think is the significance of this? And I've been observing some of the research about the relationship between the students and teachers' ideological makeup. So,
Sure.
And there's some interesting research that came out the other day. It was cited in the Washington Post that while the faculty might be more liberal, or might be liberal, and the student body might be largely liberal, just a couple of conservative or right of centre academics can have a disproportionate impact, because it may well be the first time that any liberal student, soft liberal student, had ever met a conservative faculty. Does the increasing balance towards the left on campus, does that have consequences that we should be concerned about?
So the main thing that we've seen in student body reflections of it, there are surveys of incoming freshman students and then graduating seniors to see where they stand politically. And I say young people are a little further to the left than the general public, but they're much more reflective of the broader spread in the general public. They're much closer to the general public than the faculty are. Faculty have moved far left. The student body is just a little bit left of center, and quite a sizable minority that are not left of center. And that doesn't actually really change all that much, at least in the best survey data that we have so far. In other words, they're being indoctrinated in one sense by being bombarded with all this Marxiness and critical theory and other things on campus. But I'd say the average student, it just goes in one ear and out the other ear, which actually confirms another paradox that we find in these gen ed courses. So students are required to take all of these hours in English composition or foreign language or philosophy or history, science, whatever it happens to be that's on the curriculum. But the vast majority of those students learn next to nothing in those classes. So it's not even serving the purpose.
No.
And here's the oddity of it, and this is how the rent-seeking happens. If you survey employers and ask them what are the skills that you want people that are entering the workforce to have, they'll all say the same thing. It says, well, all my employees are terrible writers. We need to make them better writers. You ask faculty the same thing.
That's also a schooling problem, isn't it? They're not being taught at school.
Exactly.
I want to stay with that at the moment, because this is the other thing that really comes through, because the point you're making is they're doing these courses and they're not actually having an effect. This is really part of the meta critique of higher education, particularly, say, the liberal arts degrees that you're describing in the US system. They're not as prevalent here, but we had Brian Kaplan. We reviewed his book in our magazine, The Case Against Education: Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money. So that's like a hardcore book staking out the territory that higher education is all about signalling. There's virtually no actual content or improvement delivered to young people that they wouldn't have achieved just by the simple effluxion of time. If you grab an 18-year-old and then compare what they're like when they're 22, they could have done anything. They could have backpacked around Europe. They could have dug ditches in Arizona. It just doesn't matter. And you explore that a little bit, but perhaps not necessarily going the 100% signalling route.
Yeah. So I think we could be fairly characterized. Both Jay and I are sympathetic to the signaling explanation, and think it generally holds up. But I'd say where we differ, or where we add some nuance to that, is differentiating between these gen ed style classes that everyone must take, and then what you choose to major in. In other words, it's very possible to go into a higher education system and choose very early on that you want to study science and focus on that, and you will emerge with a degree at the end of your career, but also better knowledge to enter into a profession or a career that requires scientific training. I think in most majors that are not done for strictly consumption purposes, the typical student is trying to learn something that's going to be applicable on their job, their career path. The problem is the way that we deliver that is very, very expensive and very inefficient, because it ends up being the case that I'd say the average student spends almost half of their time in higher ed doing things outside of their major, and the majority of that is just fluff. It's required courses that only exist on the curriculum to keep faculty employed in these rent-seeking disciplines that are unable to attract students on their own, and therefore they go the route of forcing people to attend their classes as required gen ed curricula stipulations.
No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, even that is a damning indictment. So on the one hand, just pull me up if I'm getting this wrong, but on the one hand, you have, say, the liberal arts, the humanities degrees, where it might be all BS. I think the rule of thumb is anything with studies in it can virtually be written off as containing any useful knowledge at all.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you have disciplines like science. It's creeping into engineering. We understand where things where you're actually trying to impart actual knowledge that will be used at some point in your career, but that's being crowded out. Is that essentially the point? Yeah.
I think that's absolutely a fair case and a fair indictment to make. This raises we can go back to the ethical question, the moral problems that emerge around higher education, or even as we suggested, the moral mess of higher education in the subtitle. I would argue it's fundamentally unethical to make an 18 or 19-year-old take up to 2 years of gen ed, English composition and foreign language and history classes that they get almost nothing out of. They may be paying $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 a credit hour to take these classes simply to keep faculty employed in those sectors. And that's essentially what we've devolved in the worst cases into doing.
Fantastic. So we might move on to some other things because
Sure.
You are not just the author of a book on higher education with Jason Brennan, but you've been very deeply. I'm right in saying your PhD is you're a historian by PhD, aren't you?
So it's public policy with economic history.
Public economic history. Fantastic.
Yeah.
A man from my own heart. Excellent.
There we go.
and so you've done a great deal of stuff, particularly in the last 12 months on what I'm going to call public history, I guess. The way history is used and abused in the public sphere by, in fact, practicing professional historians.
Sure.
And we might go through a couple of those if that's okay. But the real question is, and one of the interesting arguments that you've made is that Twitter, so social media use, is actually corrupting the history profession. And I'd love for you to just talk to the listeners a little bit about that. If they're not already following you on Twitter, they can see how it's happening. But if you don't mind sort of talking through how Twitter is corrupting the history profession. Right.
So quite a few academics have taken to Twitter as what appears to be currently their full-time activity. I almost wonder if we're going to look back in this era and see a measurable drop-off in research output because 90% of the American Academy was sitting on Twitter, either live tweeting the Democratic debates or live tweeting the impeachment trial or angrily posting things against Trump. That seems to be quite a few of them are actually doing it.
We all have to make a contribution somehow.
There are no students in the faculty, so they have to find something to do. There's no students to teach them.
Exactly. So you've seen this in quite a few of the humanities, but also disciplines across the board, that faculty, as they have discovered social media, they've increased their own online presence. And I think the ideal version of this is, well, it's a great dissemination of knowledge. It's a way to communicate with the public. But, if anyone spends more than 5 minutes on Twitter, you quickly discover it's a very abrasive communication system. It's not a congenial faculty lounge debate club where you are teasing out issues. Actually, what you find in commonplace, and I've experienced this in many, many instances, is tenured elite faculty that are supposedly top experts in their subject matters and full professors in their field, teaching at elite Ivy League institutions, are some of the worst actors that you'll encounter on Twitter as far as it goes with name calling, with just dismissive abrasiveness. Sometimes they'll outright fabricate things. The one example that comes to mind recently in my own experience. So we have this thing in the United States called the 1619 Project. Mm-hmm. It's a big public history initiative of the New York Times to reinvestigate how slavery shaped the emergence of the United States of America. So it's got some merit to it as a topic, but it's also a very selective historical approach that comes with a heavy left-wing ideology. and quite a bit of academia has gotten on board with this. Well, it's also a research area that I've worked on and published on, so I challenged in a nuanced way, but also very heavily challenged some of the claims that were published by the Times on this project, and that brought me into quite a bit of Twitter conflict with other historians. And rather than substantive engagement, as in like asking someone to provide sources for their claims or to consider other sources that they have omitted, I've had experiences where full tenured professors that are supposedly top experts in their field respond to a request for a citation or a request to justify a statistic with grade school "your mama" style jokes.
It strikes me that history is a interesting one to do on something like social media because
Right.
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm sure as an economic historian you've also thought about the differences between economics and history. Economics tends to think in models, so they tend to think in economists tend to try to describe a large set of actions or incentives and draw generalizations. But history is a very different profession insofar as it's interested in the exceptions, it's interested in the nuances. If you have a model, the historian should want to undermine that model by saying, well, it's not quite the case in this, or you know, that might be true in the north, but it's not true in the south, or what have you. Now, model thinking is really powerful in public debate. But exception thinking, which is and nuance thinking, is really hard to communicate, and it pushes you away from the big lessons, the huge takeouts. But it strikes me that social media is all about the big lessons and the huge takeouts.
Yeah. So the oddity here is, so history is a very, very specialized profession. I mean, it has hundreds, if not thousands, of journals that are all narrowly built around a single topic or maybe a single set of a couple decades in human history that they all focus on, and that they cater to very narrow, nuanced, high-minded investigations of a single theme or two. It's very hard to find a generalist expert. But I think one of the problems you see with history Twitter and history social media is you'll get an expert that happens to know the American Revolution really, really well, or maybe some nuance of the American Revolution really, really well. But because they've adopted a public persona, they also feel a need to weigh into the next 200 years of politics, things that are well outside of their expertise, and including in cases where what purports to be historical commentary looks an awful lot like their opinions about the last election projected on the previous 200 years.
And that's and just to you mentioned the 1619 project, because that's where it's from, where I have been sitting anyway. That's where it's come out really clearly. And as you say, it's it's an admirable project in many ways, but it's relied on this genre of new historical writing that goes loosely under this new history of capitalism, and that's an attempt to try to rewrite the history of global capitalism, the spark in economic growth that kicked off since the 18th century around things like colonial atrocities, around slavery, and it strikes me as an attempt to just really to put the model thinking back into what is actually an incredibly complex emergence of institutional forms that supported growth.
I think what's happening on Twitter in terms of historians, and we've done a lot of work at the IPA in terms of what is being taught in history at universities in Australia, and it's pretty dire. You can imagine it's all class, race and gender and everything you'd imagine. So whatever the historical period is, they'll look at it through that lens. And that's a very easy lens to replicate on Twitter. It's very simple. It's completely unnuanced, and you can just look at any period of history you wish through that lens, and it's perfect for the word count, the Twitter, whatever it is, 120.
Right. 260.
260, sorry. And I think that's part of the problem, because the historians really have taken on this way of looking at the world compared to other disciplines in the humanities from our experience. So I think that might explain why so many academics, so many historians behave so badly on Twitter.
Sure. It's oversimplification, and that's the oddity of it. I mean, that there are very good and valid reasons to study the history of race, to study the history of gender, and so forth. But they are complex, detailed, nuanced topics. They're not something that you can understand in a tweet or even a fairly established monograph. But what we have is almost like an oversimplification around this lens that yields very unrigorous scholarship that's all reductionist in nature to here's a political point about race or here's a political point about gender. And unfortunately, I think that crowds out better and more sophisticated and more tempered attempts to investigate some of the same questions and do so with solid evidence as the background.
Well, it's quite intellectually lazy, isn't it, really? And it goes
Yes.
back to sort of the immorality of really, if you think about what they should be doing in the faculty and they're not, which is tackling that complexity and actually going back to the library and opening books again. Dusty copies of things that were written 300 or 400 years ago. And like, they're probably just not. They can't be bothered doing that. It's much easier to go on Twitter.
Yep.
And a lot more fun.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But so you've talked a lot about hyper-politicized disciplines.
Yes,
And English is one of them, and hopefully history does not become one of them, but maybe it's moving in that direction. But what could be done? What does a Phil Magness reform movement or social movement?
Phil Magness University.
The Phil Magness University.
Right.
What should?
So if I could start with a blank slate and
Give
create
us
a
well,
university.
or just write a law or kill a law or whatever it is that you think. But is there a path through this? Is really what I'm asking.
Sure. So I think we're already starting to see some signs of the path that may be foisted upon it, whether the university likes it or not, and that is students voting with their feet. They're fleeing history and philosophy and English, not because they dislike history, philosophy, and English, but because those disciplines now cater to such a narrow slice of the political spectrum that they basically cut themselves off from a prospective audience. And I think it's really tragic of it. It's one of the faults. I mean, there is a thirst for historical knowledge we see all over the place. Movies that are on historical themes are often very popular. There are documentaries and TV shows on public broadcasting that are always smash hits that spill over into the public mainstream. There's a thirst for this type of knowledge, but you can't get it anymore in the university system. So people voting with their feet, I think that eventually starts to put some budgetary pressures. In other words, the gen eds can only get you so far in sustaining a faculty. At some point, there's going to be a break when universities start to realize that a lot of these programs are bloated in sizes themselves relative to the number of the students they're able to attract. So maybe that becomes a pressure point. If I were to offer reform, one of the first things I'd say would be to eliminate gen ed requirements, just cut them across the board. If you wanted to do something of a more liberal arts theme, switch over to so some of the better functioning universities, I'd say, as a model, use more like a basket system, where you are tasked that you have to take, say, 6 classes across all of these different fixed disciplines, but the choice is yours. Beyond that, as long as you hit the math credit, the science credit, the fine arts credit, it can be anything and everything. That introduces a little bit more of a marketplace than as opposed to you must take English composition 101, 102, and 103, followed by British literature through the lens of Karl Marx, which is much more in the line of, I think, what the rigidity that we've started to see emerge. Also, I'd say get rid of these god-awful first-year experience classes that are taught everywhere.
What is a first-year experience class? Take us through.
Oh, yeah, first-year experience classes.
I feel like you get the first-year experience
being
for free.
in first year. Yeah.
Oh, essentially, right. Well, it's the idea behind it is that students show up on campus and they're young people. They don't quite know what they want to do. So in addition to taking the standard curriculum of courses they're required to, they all must sit in this massive seminar where they read the same book together or work through a thematic discussion of, and it's always on some social problem. So it'll be like environmental justice.
Oh, dear.
You get these classes, and they're often taught in really awful ways. The types that have a lot of group projects in them, and a professor that doesn't really lecture so much as tries to facilitate a discussion of feelings. And what it really ends up being is that these courses are just a massive waste of time and money because no one really gets anything out of it. But they do employ faculty in disciplines that have trouble attracting students. So suppose you have a poetry department that no one signs up for the poetry class, and you're looking around, well, we need someone to teach the first year experience course. Oh, there's Professor so-and-so in the poetry department. Come on over. And they'll put them in that. So it really becomes, it's another face of this wealth transfer mechanism from economically precarious 18 and 19-year-olds to middle-aged, upper middle class, tenured professors. So really kind of a nightmare of a system in that sense.
Not to mention all the admin staff that you need to employ to run the first year experience.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
but they like that because that gives them more reason to hire.
Yes, that's what I mean. It goes in their favour.
One of the other things Magness University could grapple with, which is this vexed idea of academic freedom. And if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to read out a quote from a book by John Silber called "Poisoning the Wells of Academe," because for anyone in the Western tradition, freedom of inquiry is vital, and academic freedom, did mean something and has some ongoing meaning. But in the words of John Silber, the way it's interpreted now is academic freedom is the absolute concept by which the academic can say whatever he pleases about whenever he pleases, wherever he pleases, and be fully immune from unpleasant consequences.
Right.
He said it's been once upon a time it was an immunity for what is said and done by dedicated, thoughtful, conscientious scholars in the pursuit of truth. Now it's for whatever's said, whether recklessly or carelessly, incompetently by incompetent, frivolous, and even malevolent operators. So it's one of the things you could grapple with is academic freedom and tenure and that whole nest of issues.
Sure. So I'm going to paraphrase a quote from this is one of my intellectual heroes, Jim Buchanan, which I think is very obviously comes through in some of the work. But he used to liken the emergent case around what academic freedom is deployed for, especially on, he was noticing a leftward trend in the academy in his own day. So he's writing in the 1970s for some context. But he says that the average faculty member approaches the university system as this public-funded entity where he expects the taxpayers to walk up to a wall and throw a bag of money over it and never ask what happens to that money when it falls on the other side of the wall. And I think we're actually seeing quite a bit of that effect because, some of the faculty that very heavily rely on public funding to operate these institutions to essentially subsidize what they do also are the loudest opponents to any and every form of budgetary scrutiny and oversight that comes from public expenditure. And we've got a bit of a paradox here because, I value academic freedom and would adhere to it as a steadfast principle that I think we absolutely need to protect open inquiry, especially for minority viewpoints. So there's another thing that is not often afforded, but minority viewpoints need academic freedom. At the same time, the fact that we are publicly subsidizing and investing resources of the taxpayers into the university system comes with an obligation that the university is a good steward of those resources. That would be the same would be true of the public roads construction crew. If it was taking gobs of public money and rather than building the roads it was supposed to be building was re-diverting them into vacation homes for the people that worked in that agency, there would be a backlash. There would be a very reasonable form of inquiry. So we'd ask the question, if the public is funding major university systems to encourage education in basic American history and Shakespeare and how to do chemistry, how to do basic mathematics, but that money is being taken and re-diverted over into grievance studies and maybe learning the critical theory interpretation of why capitalism is evil and all these pet political projects that seem to be emerging in the place of traditional disciplines. I think the public actually has a right to ask the question, why are we funding this thing at the level that we do?
Yeah, damn straight. It's a classic, that aforementioned wall. It's almost like the academic leaps over the wall and hits people over the head with his or her ideas and picks fights And then
Yes,
whenever
yes.
anybody fights back, they leap back over the wall saying, academic freedom, academic, you're attacking knowledge, you're
So they
attacking
retreat to it.
science, and, you can't touch me.
Yeah.
That's essentially what they're doing.
Yeah, so I'd say you could have one or the other. You could have high levels of public funding and then reasonable expectations of what that funding is used on, or you could take away the public funding and then it could be a free-for-all behind the wall. But you take away the public funding, you discover very quickly we can no longer support a poetry department with 60 people in it servicing 3 students.
But then where will poetry come from?
Yeah,
Phil?
no,
Where will poetry-
I think taking away some public funding is a terrific
it's a great idea.
It's a wonderful note to finish on. Phil Magness, thank you so much for joining us today. That's been absolutely terrific. If you ever do make it down under, we'd love to have you.
I'd love to.
Excellent. So today, Phil, you've been listening to me, Scott Hargreaves, also Dr. Chris Berg,
Thank you so much, Phil.
and Dr.
Yeah,
Bella
thanks.
Debrera.
Thank you.
And for
Thank
our
you.
listeners, we'll be back with our regular episode of Looking Forward next week. Thanks very much.